I think also we've been very inspired by the work of, for example, Daniel Kahneman and Nassim Taleb, who keep bringing up these studies that show us that not only is our intuition not as good as we think it is, it's usually pretty horrible. Like it's our intuition is terrible, and we're not very good at measuring precise stuff
No.
with our minds alone.
Hi, I'm Oliver Thorpe. I'm a parkour athlete, climber, and teacher.
And I am Thijs Hvid. I'm a professional dancer, a fighter, and a teacher.
And together we have created the coaching platform Ascending Strength.
Ascending Talks is a series of reflections and thoughts based on our work within the Ascending Strength coaching platform, as well as some maybe unconventional tutorials from time to time, and what we learn from engaging with and interacting with our students.
The theme of today is training schedules, why it's important to schedule your training, and also a loose guide of how you can create a training schedule for yourself.
Regarding the first one, why is it important to schedule your training? The immediate answer would be it's not. Not in an objective sense, but we'll get back to that. Why we have told our students that it could be important to schedule your training is because training schedules in the Russian way that inspired us it's a system that we can convey, and it's a system that we can measure. And the reason that could be important is because it's easier to tamper with, and it's easier to adjust for the individual rather than systems based solely on, for example, intuition.
I think intuitive systems, if something goes wrong in the training, it's very hard to figure out sort of what it was. Like, were you training too much? Were you training too little?
Yeah.
Why? Like, what's it's almost impossible to figure out where to sort of change things.
Yeah. I think also we've been very inspired by the work of, for example, Daniel Kahneman and Nassim Taleb, and generally like psychologists and authors who keep bringing up these studies that show us that not only is our intuition not as good as we think it is, it's usually pretty horrible. Like it's our intuition is terrible, and we're not very good at measuring precise stuff with our minds alone.
Exactly.
We need objective measurements if we want to keep things fairly objective.
Yes.
And
like another thing they also talk about is that our feelings don't tell us as much as we think they tell us.
Yeah.
Which is it's a very sort of important thing to keep in mind, because we're not that great at sensing variations and.
No, and the fact that you feel that a training was bad doesn't necessarily mean that that training was bad, in the sense of like you might be able to lift more on the days where you feel you had a crappier training.
Yeah.
You might be able to.
Maybe you just felt like shit, but you were actually really strong.
Yeah.
Like that'll afterwards it'll stick in your mind as like, oh, that was a shitty training. But then if you look at your training plans, like, oh wow, okay, that was actually objectively a pretty good training.
You fucking smashed it.
Yeah.
And vice versa.
Yes.
You can have trainings where you feel amazing, but if you measured your, I don't know, height of a box jump from one session to another, that might be a day where you felt great, but you were fatigued and you couldn't perform as well as you thought. So that's one of the reasons that you actually measure your progress.
And that also leads us into one of our other points, is that we have a tendency to overestimate single sessions a lot compared to the big picture.
Yeah. If you had a crappy training, your tendency is to think that your overall training generally these days or these weeks or this month
is
shitty. Yeah. If you had a great couple of sessions, that usually becomes your new subjective baseline for how well you're doing.
Yes.
And it's not very indicative of what's actually going on.
No.
And talking about things that feel shitty, that's another reason to make it measurable. Because what we usually ask our students to do is to keep a training log or a training journal.
Yes.
Which is also part of measuring a training schedule. Because in that you can actually track your progress. And if you measured your scheduling of your training, quote unquote, correctly, then you can actually see that there's like consistent progress.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. And if there isn't, again, then you kind of like measured everything so you can actually
adjust on the small parameters and,
Exactly.
and figure out, maybe it's because I'm doing a little bit too much.
Yeah.
And you can sort of dial down on the...
And usually it's because you're doing a little bit too much.
As we said before, we're going to give you a little example of how you could plan a training session. And we're going to be using a little bit of terminology that maybe some of you aren't quite familiar with. So we're just going to define some of the words used. First off, we have reps, which is short for repetitions. And it's just defined as one complete movement of a specific exercise. So for example, if we're doing squats, it's from when you're standing, you go down, and then back up to standing. That's one repetition.
Then we have sets. Sets are groupings or clusters of repetitions. So let's say you did 10 repetitions of a squat, and then you do that 5 times. We have a small break in between each cluster. That's your sets. So you could do 5 sets of 10 reps. So 10 squats, small break, 10 squats again, small break, etc.
Yes, and that brings us to volume, which is just the total amount of work done over a specific time period. So for example, Thijs' example, the volume would be 50 reps, like 50 squats.
That's the overall volume.
The overall volume, yes.
Yeah.
And it's usually measured over one training, but can also be over more time.
And in the end we have intensity. And intensity is a measure of how difficult or hard something is. The more intense an exercise is, the fewer repetitions you can do. So it's a measure of how many we can do versus how difficult it is to do each repetition. This is an example of a training program focusing on developing explosive strength of the lower body using body weight exercises. First up is general warm-up. The general warm-up should take somewhere between 5 to 10 minutes and no more. The purpose is to get you warm and excited, something we find many dancers and parkour people leave out of their own training when they're responsible for it themselves. Running with a few sprints here and there works, rope skipping works, jumping up and down on the spots with a few burpees in between works as well.
Next up is technical work. And for technical work, we have standing box jumps. And this is placed early in the schedule, so you can focus on fine-tuning your technical cues before you get too fatigued. Now, some people, they place box jumps later in the schedule, but since we use these with a parkour perspective in mind, we should have a slightly more technical approach. We're going to do 3 to 5 sets, and 10 reps per set should be hard but manageable.
Our main work is shrimp squats and Harrop curls. The main work is the bulk of the work from a strength perspective. It's generally very heavy or very explosive. We up the sets here since it's the main part or our main focus, and we do 5 to 6 sets in a session, but we also up the intensity so that your starting max is about 4 repetitions. And you start by doing only 2 repetitions per set in the beginning of the phase, adding from there over the course of the phase.
After the main work, we have back-off work. And essentially a back-off set is a way to squeeze slightly more volume out of your main work by lowering the intensity so you can up the volume, because you'll often fatigue slightly too soon by the high intensity of the main work.
Finally, for this example of a program, we have auxiliary work. Auxiliary work is also referred to as supplementary work. This is an umbrella term for working on shortcomings within the theme of your schedule. So here is sissy squats, used to strengthen the anterior structures of the knees. We do 2 to 3 sets, and 12 reps per set should be your maximal amount, but you do 10 reps per set.
Remember that the sets and reps that we've used in this example are not absolutes, and it will depend on what you're training, who you are, where you are in your training as well. To round this little talk off, we're going to come back to why planning a training schedule might not be important. There's lots of examples of people who do very well without planning training schedules.
Most people who do a lot of like non-organized athletic disciplines, professional dancers or boulders or a lot of fighters, they train on a daily basis without anyone ever talking about reps and sets. This might also bring us to the next thing, which is the reason why this is okay is because frequency is usually the best teacher.
Yeah.
The best way to get good at something is because
Just to do it a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you spend a lot of time around parkour people, and you spend a lot of time training parkour, and you constantly think about parkour and constantly watch parkour videos,
You're probably
then-
going to get better at parkour.
most likely. And all of the concepts you usually train within a training schedule, for example, explosive pulling or explosive jumping or static holds or whatever else you could be training, usually exists in a non-condensed form within your discipline or your sport. But that also kind of brings us back to why you could benefit from making a training schedule, which is because it's a way of condensing a single element within your discipline or within your sport.
And also, it's a way to, if you want to get better at something, it's a way to make sure that you're actually doing that thing enough to get better at it.
Yeah.
So, a little piece of advice to finish off with: start small, pick one thing, and then maybe do it 2 times a week.
So this means that, let's say you want to develop your squatting strength, you don't actually have to start out with having like technical warm-up, technical training, then going on to your main work, then doing your auxiliary work. If you want to get better at squatting, do squats. Decide if you want to do front squats or back squats or some kind of misaligned squats or whatever you want to do, but just do squats. Maybe do 6 sets of squats at a certain intensity. Maybe do some back off work, but that's all you have to do. You don't have to pack all this in a schedule. But if you find yourself plateauing, either in your intuitive training or in your scheduled training, it might be because there's a lot to gain from structuring your training very precisely.
We'd like to give a big thank you to Zaur and Will for letting us use their clips in this video.
They're both amazing athletes in their own right and amazing movement practitioners. So go check out their stuff, and a link to their profiles will be in the description.
Thanks for joining Ascending Talks, and we will see you next time.